How's it going, YouTube? Want to do a quick video talking about 4 decks that you guys should pay attention to, experiment with, look out for, and know they're going to be in the meta, especially for the, upcoming regionals, ascents, whatever it might be. So I'm just going to jump right into it. So the first deck you're going to want to be aware of is Specter package, and mainly the Crux Specter package. Because of this, there's 2 different variants. There's like a Merlin build, and there's also Lorraine Crux Knight. So one is going for Ensoul because they can run so many sword attacks or sword weapons in their material deck. And the other one is just Merlin because Merlin's good and it's Crux, so they get a lot of value. But basically the Specter package, what is it? Well, you've probably heard us talk about it a lot, so I won't go too deep into it, but essentially it's a really efficient way to put a lot of cards in your graveyard that are going to give you value, whether it be float or liminal guide. Their whole game plan is to level up really efficiently, have a bunch of influence when they get to level 3, and use that influence to kill you pretty much on the spot, or just, again, keep gaining value to push you out of the game. One of the ways you can fight against this type of deck is any kind of graveyard hate. So that could be something as simple as raccoons, scavenging raccoons, beautiful new art in the set, so that could be a really good card. But probably the more important one is Censor. Now, Censor, we've seen it being played last set against Fractals, against Genbu, less against Fractals, but more against Genbu, as self-mill water decks were able to put so much water and float into their graveyard. This turns off specifically the floating memory, but it also turns off the additional effect of liminal guide. Having a Censor on board is really big. It slows them down and takes away that tempo that they initially got. Also, if you're running something, a decent amount of unique allies, you can run something like Mandate of Honor. Mandate of Honor is a similar thing. It's going to slow down the amount of influence that they can have in hand and slow down their turns and force them to deal with it because they can't get above 8 cards. So that's Crux, Merlin / Specter package. There'll probably be other versions of Specter package that go into CL or go into Diana or go into Ari, and Luxem, of course, as well. So pay attention to those decks as well, but just know that a really efficient graveyard is going to be, decks are going to be a thing. Another deck to pay attention to is Water Diana. Now, Water Diana, and maybe I'll put this into a water self-mill decks in general, but specifically Water Diana with the new cards gets a lot of value from graveyard, similar to Specter, because they are milling so many floating memory cards. So they use Paladins and, Frostborn Paladins and Crystalline Archers to use those floating memory to gain a lot of value, whether it be more damage, more card draw, whatever. Now, Lost in Thought is gone, so you're not going to see them do crazy turns with that floating memory where they draw 4 or 5 cards, but they are still going to get value. So something that's really good against them, like I was just mentioning with Specter package, is Scavenging Raccoons and Censor. Now, another card, I didn't mention this as Specter, kind of forgot about it, but same good against Specter as well, but is Cleansing Reunion. If you are in specifically Wind, you can use Cleansing Reunion to specifically get rid of a large chunk of cards out of the graveyard. So that's something that you might be trying to run with or mess around with when playing against the first 2 decks. The third deck I want to talk about is Fire Aggro. Now, there's lots of different types of builds for Fire Aggro. There's Faiza, Philo, Fire Guo Jia, Fire Daochan. All these decks are slightly different, but they all are essentially trying to kill their opponent on turn 3, 4, 5, not extending the game, and they attack from multiple angles, being non-attack damage and attack damage. They both have allies and or some attacks with Impact Hammer and Heated Vengeance, and then they have a bunch of different variants on non-attack damage, whether it be Blazing Throws or Conflagration for Daochan or Shimmering Refraction from Daochan or from Guo Jia. They have a bunch of things like Vermilion Decrees and other variants, essentially. These decks can attack from 2 different aspects and deal 2 different types of damage, and so it's important for you guys at the start of a meta to really be prepared for both types. Playing stuff like Resolute Stand, really solid against those boards of allies. Playing stuff like the new Safeguard Paragon, that can stop non-attack damage. Veiling Breeze, if you're in Wind, has always been a classic card that can stop both types of damage. So just being aware of those things can really help you stay alive and get to your game plan, whatever deck you are playing. Something that's also important against these decks is that they usually have some kind of fire graveyard to them. Now, some play into it more than others. I would say Philo, Fire Lorraine, plays with the fire graveyard the most. Faiza and Guo Jia being the second most, or next tier under that, and Guo Jia doesn't really have a ton of fire graveyard stuff, but they can play anything with Kindle really easily if they're getting rid of a bunch of fire cards. And so something like Azure Protective Trinket is actually really good against these decks now. We haven't seen Azure Protective Trinket in a long time, but it is a very cool card, specifically against any deck that is trying to put fire cards in their graveyard, because you can specifically target those cards that you want to get rid of, things that you think might be really strong, such as March Hare, a new unique ally from DTR that can really pump value and just a ton of synergies in these fire aggro decks. So that's like a major one you might want to hit. Nullifying Lantern, of course, also good, and Scavenging Raccoon's also good in that case. So think about these cards. While Fire Graveyard isn't their main, source of damage, it definitely helps facilitate that. So any way you can turn off their other extra damage and recognize when they're going to be utilizing it can be huge in those matchups. The last deck I want to talk about is Suited. Now, Suited definitely seemed a little on the weaker side when people were trying to build it and figure it out before the set release, but it definitely has some strengths to it, and it's definitely something you should be careful of. So Suited, while you might not think it's strong, if they get a board, if you have a deck that you are playing that doesn't have any way to deal with the board, it is going to deal a lot of damage to you and get a lot of value really quickly, way faster than you think. All they need to have is 2, maybe 3 Suited allies on board, and they're going to be just pumping damage. This can be even, they have 2 allies on board and then they play a 3rd one, because those activated abilities on those allies are just going to generate them so much tempo. So something that's really important against these types of decks are if you can play ally hate, if you can play board clears, of course. Flame Sweep is a classic one. The new Fire Diana, there's another Aether Charge card that deals 3 damage to all allies on board. That's really good. Anything you can play to slow them down is huge. And Snaring Fumes, if you're in Wind, is another really good card to play against any kind of ally board, especially if you're playing ally, in conjunction with Art of War. So slowing them down, killing off their allies, making sure you're trading. If you're on an ally deck yourself, make sure to trade into their Suited allies. You might think, oh, it's just a 1/2, I don't have to respect it, but that 1/2 can further their 2/3s and bigger allies really quickly, because those activate abilities come online much more quickly than you would expect. That's really important. Again, with all these decks that we've been talking about, there is a slight graveyard aspect to it. The Queen of Hearts is a 10-drop 4/4 that gives all the other Suited allies +1 attack, and then also makes them immortal. Now, that is a expensive cost, but it can be cheated out because of other Suited allies in the graveyard specifically. So again, stuff like Azure Protective Trinket, stuff like Scavenging Raccoon, stuff like Cleansing Reunion are all huge in that matchup when you're feeling like a Queen of Hearts can come online. So make sure you're thinking about all this stuff. Graveyard hate seems to be at an all-time high in this set, so definitely respect graveyards, because there's so many decks that can play even just a little bit of, with it. They don't have to be their whole game plan, but it helps facilitate pretty much every single game plan of those decks. So definitely pay attention to it. We'll catch you on the next one. Peace.